Welcome back, friends. Just a little mop up from the last episode. I made the quote, the liturgy is not about us, but about God. And I got that from Alcu and Reed, The Organic Development of the Liturgy, with a foreword by Ratzinger, Ignatius Press, 2005. So the footnotes will have that, but that's another absolute excellent resource to really get a good sense of what is going on with the liturgy. All right, back to the promised topic, the Old Testament and New Testament. It was specific and it was directed by God. It was not a committee concoction. One of the charges Yahweh will level against the people is that they did not fulfill the Sinai covenant. And the penalty for that failure will be exile and servitude. A substantial portion of the Sinai covenant is the public worship of the Lord. Okay, so you'll read prophets, and so I'm in Isaiah right now teaching under that. All right, they're going to be talking about the covenant. You broke the covenant. Well, which covenant are we talking about? The Abrahamic covenant, the Noahic? I think there's an Adam and Eve, Adamic. They're talking mostly the Sinai. That's the one with Moses, the Mosaic covenant. Sometimes we hear that. Okay, and Leviticus. Let me tell you, Leviticus is chock full, right? The whole book is on liturgical prescriptions, as is Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy has a fair share of that as well. So covenant is the public worship of the Lord, and it was very specific and precise. Moses, yes, Leviticus details requirements. And so when the people don't fulfill their part of the bargain, they're part of the oath. It's more than agreement. They entered into it an oath. The prophets are sent to them to warn them to get right with that. So they need to worship him both in spirit, from the heart, right, and by truth, the letter of the law. Both matter. Both and. Father Mager gives a very excellent summary. Let's see. Let's wave his book. Father Mager, that's his book. How Christ said the first Mass. And he goes through the Old Testament prescriptions. So that would have been what the apostles would have been very used to. And even though there was a very short, brief, but it was their time in Christian homes, that's training is still in their mind. And that's what really will propel them back into public venues, to the extent they can be public without being arrested, tortured. We've got to remember, torture is considered at that time a really great way to get to the truth of the matter. So to be accused of being Christian, you would be tortured of various degrees. So it was really a very dangerous proposition. So something very compelling, very much strong in their psyche, very much in their theology, compels them to do this. Whereas, where it would have been just safer, I'm home on the Sabbath and it's just me and the Lord, and we're just going to have our own time together,
Yeah, I think that temptation toward the people who are opposed to the church love to trot out the individual line of Christ where he says, go pray to God in silence, right? In the secret of your room, right? And they ignore 2,000 years of obvious public worship. And there has never been any recognition that there was a hypocrisy there, right? And it fundamentally comes down to the fact that God is capable of both and, right? He's never an either or type proposition, unless it's in regards to sin, right? I mean, you choose good or you choose evil. I mean, in regards to that, that is probably the only proposition that our Lord, might have an either or proposition, except for the fact that he can do good out of everything, right? I mean, so he tells you not to do evil, but understands that if you do, that his will not be thwarted. So in consequence, to have that temptation now is, especially at a time where there's no risk, particularly in America, right? There's no risk to public worship, although the risks are growing. I mean, you can see it daily. Risks are growing even in countries that we would have once upon a time thought that there was no potential threat towards public worship. But that encroaching darkness is always just a step away. And the only way that it is thwarted is through the courageous living out of a public liturgy that must be embraced and brought back to a level of dignity and respect that it once had. And I think that part of the problem with that is going to be a true restoration of the home, and that is why I did think that it's an important topic to talk about the liturgy writ large, so that we can restore to the home the liturgy. If we're going to talk about the liturgy in the public as capital letters, then the liturgy in the home can be the lowercase. But they're both fundamental to a true restoration of, of goodness, beauty, and truth, really.
That's right. So it's imperative to have a sense of the Old Testament liturgy because that is the pedagogy of God. God prepares his people very carefully. He's not a God of surprises in regard to his honor. The apostles and St. Paul, along with the church fathers from the very first centuries, would have modeled their liturgy after the Old Testament, though adapted to a Christian message. Some theologians propose that Christ, during his 40 days after the ascension, directly taught the apostles how he wanted the liturgy to be conducted. And that is reason of what, and that is reason of why in the earliest years, the various public expressions of worship have several similarities. So we know we have about 24 or various sundry rites, not counting the most recent of ones. But in their nascent moments, they all have similar features. So let's consider, I said there's a theologian, here's one. Professor Gambler, Modern Rite, page 77. The fundamental acts of worship of the early church, the celebration of the Eucharist, the rites of the sacraments, prayer in common, and the liturgical sermon, all go back to the express command of Jesus, or at least based on his example and commendation. Jesus, however, did not originate these liturgical acts, but took them over from the practice of late Judaism. The primitive church continued this policy. To a limited extent, it created it of its own accord forms of worship which had not already been laid down by Jesus. But to a much greater extent, it fashioned its worship according to the liturgical customs of Judaism. In Gentile congregations, borrowings would have been made increasingly from their religious practices of the Greco-Roman world. And I know it's not a practice, but I just think architecturally speaking, there would have been some basilicas and they're not being used anymore, and they would have been commandeered and so forth and so on. Your surroundings inform your liturgy. That's why there are liturgical norms for how you build a church, and why some churches over the centuries, have such a profound influence on faith, and others do not. Others do not.
Yeah, I think that there is an element of the truth of the human person that finds a natural reflecting point or reflection in the construction of right spaces of worship. Something in them profoundly speaks to the human soul in ways that other places don't. You can tell when you've walked into a holy space, and then you can tell when you've walked into a trailer park or to a truck driving school, right? I mean, like they're or a brutalist school. And I think that it's been an unfortunate century for us to live in, because there was surely an element rather to try and demonstrate that natural tendency of man to worship God in a particular manner was simply culturally driven, as opposed to being innately instinctive to the human person. And I think that if anything that we learned at all in the 20th century is that it's true that man is called to worship God in a particular manner that is irrespective of generation, that it doesn't have to do with a cultural truth. It has to do with the truth of the human soul and the longing that is put inside of him. Because even when you look at, let's say, the largest structures in our cities anymore, right, which are our sports arenas and different things like that, there is an element of loveliness and elegance and arrangement of motion of people, visually, where we're sitting. How do we participate within the game? What is happening? Like you can almost see sort of like the choir set up, right, of a church that would have had a prayer where one person would do the verse and then the other would do the response, right, going back and forth in the way that we have people on one side of the team cheering for their guy. Like, I mean, there is so much that could be used as a referential parallel, that if we're a strong student of the liturgy just in and of itself, one begins to see that man is going to create a liturgy for himself, because he is by nature, like, Aristotle would have said that man by nature is a political animal, but I think that he could have also said man by nature is a religious animal.
That's right. That's right. They will make. We have a a capacity to worship anything, right?
Yeah.
If anything from the plagues taught, we can worship a frog, we can worship anything. God himself has to intervene and show us that which is appropriate to our
Right.
dignity and that which is not. All right, friends, let's come back to in the next episode. Till then, Fides et Ratio.